there's one thing that we all learn by watching children and adults shift school and work to a virtual remote format over the last 2 years, is that there's a huge difference between showing up and actually engaging.
And just because you attend an online class, it doesn't mean that you are actually engaging in that class and actually learning and growing your mind.
In the same way, there's a huge difference between a patient properly using, i.e., being compliant with or adhering to the use of a medical device at home, and a patient actively seeking to squeeze every ounce of clinical value out of that device to improve their own outcomes.
Increasingly, the healthcare and medtech industries are evolving to support remote diagnosis, monitoring, and treatment of health conditions by patients and their caregivers. But without the benefit of the doctor's office, hospital, or real-time supervision, this can get complicated.
So, how do we get patients and their caregivers not just to use devices, but to actively engage with them in the best way possible to improve their own healthcare? And for those with chronic conditions, how do we make this happen as a regular routine that just happens without intervention by the provider or payer?
That's what we're going to be discussing in this three-part series on patient engagement in connected medical devices, presented by Orthogonal.
I'm Bernhard Kappa, founder and CEO of Orthogonal. We're all about improving patient outcomes faster. We mostly work in software as a medical device and connected medical device systems, and we apply modern methods within the regulatory constraints to build, evolve, and scale solutions faster.
And I'm Adrian Pittman, user experience design and human factors expert, currently director of product design at LinkedIn, previously of Google and Orthogonal. We'd like to thank you for joining us today to listen to the first of a three-part series from our recent conversations with two fantastic industry experts who shared their experience and perspectives with us on patient engagement and connected medical devices.
That's right. For this conversation, we brought together two people whose work I deeply admire. Christy Zuber, the founder and managing director of Aspen Labs, and Gia Roselles, director of user experience at Becton Dickinson.
In our first episode, we're going to talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the way that we think about how patients engage with and use health services generally, and connected devices more specifically. We'll be looking at some of the ways that telemedicine and virtual care have bridged the enormous challenges introduced to the healthcare system by COVID-19, and some of the ways that connected medical devices have and have not helped close some of those gaps. First, I'd like to let our guests introduce themselves to you, and then we'll jump in.
My name is Christy Zuber. I'm the founder and managing director of Aspen Labs. We do a human-centered design approach to understanding people's needs across communities and organizations and working with them through a co-design approach to design different solutions. We anchor ourselves in healthcare. It's not the sole space that we're in, but it's definitely our anchor. Prior to Aspen Labs, I spent about 17 years founding and leading the human-centered design and innovation practice for Kaiser Permanente across the country. We opened up all sorts of innovation centers to understand how we get into the heads and the lives of people across many different communities. And that really lit the fire in a lot of the things that my team and I are doing now. We do a lot of things in the space around safety net and underserved communities and how those things are evolving and changing in the future.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gia Roselles. Currently, I'm the Senior Director of User Experience Design at Becton Dickinson, which is a big medical device manufacturer. For the past 25-ish years, my role has been to help companies build user-centered design thinking methods into their R&D processes. If user-centered design is separate from R&D, it just doesn't get done. I worked for a long time at Intuit, and I think we had big success there, making our design thinking blended into R&D so that no one ever thought about it. It was just part of how we developed products. Trying to do the same thing now at Becton Dickinson. which is a much bigger company than Intuit, and initially was a little daunting. What's great for me about being at BD is working in the regulated medical devices space and having a patient at the end of everything we do. It really makes a huge difference in how I view my work. My favorite thing is taking marketing folks and engineers into a hospital to actually watch clinicians doing their work in their chaotic environment with their usual workflow, which is much more complex than people realize. And seeing my colleagues have a revelation that they didn't know the users as well as they thought, and that technology itself isn't the solution that we need to start with. We need to start with understanding the users.
Well said. I think that's a really important thing, whether these are clinicians or they are patients. Ultimately, they're people dealing with work, with life, and things that are changing pretty quickly, new demands that are being placed on them, whether that's new changes to the EMR or different workflows or new diseases that they've had to deal with. I know in my wife's case, she's an anesthesiologist, and when COVID hit, that was a huge change, really revamping all of the safety protocols and everything around that. The vacation we were supposed to take to go to Italy instead was spent revamping the protocols for patients, because at that point we didn't necessarily know, do they have COVID, do they not? When do you do testing? How do you protect when you can't do testing or the testing is inconclusive? Huge changes, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, the pandemic has had an outsized impact on things that were stress points before the pandemic, right? You could argue that it's revealed, possibly accelerated some things that were happening at maybe a different speed or a different level of intensity beforehand. From your perspectives, where is the most movement in industry attitudes towards digital health tech since the pandemic started?
I think we definitely saw a measurable increase in telehealth, and that arguably is actually the simplest part of digital technology to apply to healthcare because it's everything is the same except we're over video instead of in person. Whereas a lot of other e-technology is going to be a lot more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. I think jumping onto that, we had the ability to do a lot of care virtually before. That wasn't new during the pandemic, but I think what it did propel is put people in a place where they had to not just lightly consider adopting it and using it, but fully embracing it. So really, it was that those attitudes and those behaviors of, if we don't have a choice, then we'll give it a try and be okay with clunky or be okay with imperfect more so than before. So I think it increased people's willingness or need to actually try it and jump in and evolve it. The pre-pandemic, it was just like anything else. It's easier to stay in the stream that you're already in, get care the way that you're already getting care, provide care the way you're already providing care. So it's really, I think, more behavioral than anything. It's really not a lot of new technology was created, but the human willingness is what really adjusted.
Right. The necessity to really just, you have no choice right
Right.
now to do that.
Yeah.
Um, I think there were a number of things that were improved and some things were not as good. My brother-in-law is a psychiatrist. They did not do any televisits in his practice before, but then they switched totally to those types of practices.
Yeah.
And for talk therapy kinds of things, for about half the people, it was about the same. For about a quarter of them, it was much worse. They really needed to be in person.
Mhm.
And then for a quarter of them, it was better because those people didn't show up previously. And
Yeah.
now there was additional accessibility and really sort of expanding who was being served.
Yeah. Bernard, I think that's part of to me, what's really exciting about all of this is, when you really start digging into accessibility, there's nothing that provides that kind of accessibility in the way that telemedicine can. We need better infrastructure backbone to allow that to happen. And that, is probably going to be part of our conversation today. What we can do and areas that we can reach, people that we can, make sure have access that didn't for a number of reasons, whether it's financial, whether it's geography, whether it's timing, for a whole host of reasons, now make that really possible, which is exciting. And so I think there's a lot when we talk about lifestyles and how we make it really work to optimize it, but the future's bright.
Yeah, COVID was basically an experiment that we were forced into,
Yeah.
and telehealth was something that we could already do but didn't want to, but then we had to. And I love that we accidentally uncovered this great need that we can solve with telehealth in behavioral health, psychology, psychiatry.
Yeah.
I think vast numbers of people who weren't getting treatment before found it easier to enter and get treatment remotely
Hmm.
than to actually go in person. And I think that's a great accidental find.
What's interesting about that is, you mentioned or previously was mentioned this concept of like accessibility, just having access to care. And certainly that became challenging when you could no longer, say, go into the clinic to visit face to face with your care provider. And at the same time, expanding the understanding of who we're serving, right? Going beyond just the end consumer of these services and products are patients, but they're also medical practitioners as well. Let me give you a scenario. For instance, the patient brings in a device. They come in with some health tool they want to use. It could be a wearable, it could be a over the counter device, something that they brought with them from their previous health engagement with a prior care provider, but the physician doesn't want to use it. They don't trust the output. They don't really think it integrates well with their clinical setup, or the doctor recommends a completely different device and the patient hates that device because it doesn't fit with their lifestyle. Have you observed that dynamic? And if so, what would you characterize are the biggest hurdles to driving that alignment between each group exercising their agency to the benefit of the care procedure?
Yeah, one thing that I would say about devices is I think there's a lot of prongs to it. I'll give an example. When I was working at Kaiser Permanente, when we first started using remote devices, and we were pretty ahead of the curve on adoption of those sorts of things because we just had the scale to be able to do that. And we were finding that physicians or nurse practitioners, would recommend, utilize ABC device, go home, we'll send you the things and, we'll start monitoring that. Clinicians that were accepting of devices now given, there's, a set of things. So they're waiting for that information to start coming in and it's not happening and it's not happening. And so we thought we had an uptake issue with patients that they really didn't want it. And so we were addressing all these things around, how are we introducing it to them? What are we saying to them? What are their reactions when they're in the clinic setting, when you are talking about this? So we're going through all these sort of troubleshooting things. And then we decided we do ethnographic research. Let's, apply it here. And so we went into the field with some of our IT professionals into the homes to see, what's the hitch here. So we went in and we observed one of our patients getting the gear and everything and opening it up. And there was a card in there that said, first open up a browser, et cetera, step by step. And they said, what's a browser? And that was it. They put the card back in the box and pushed the box away. So, sometimes it's those really unexpected things. You're trying to unpack some really complex dynamic. And sometimes it's as simple as a term that people get tripped up on. So that's just to say that I think we have a lot to learn by actually really observing people in context, how those conversations are happening, what steps are people really taking, where are things falling apart? Because I think sometimes that happens in really unexpected places.
I love that you solved that problem with ethnographic research, Christy.
I mean, ultimately, right? The thing to think about is those of us who are in software, for software and hardware, very often you're just focused purely on what you're doing,
Yeah.
specifically when they're using the device or when they're using the software, not the entire context of what's their journey like, what actually happens, and all of the things that happen outside of the use of your software
Yeah.
and your product, because that has a huge impact. Who suggested that they use this? Who suggests that they use something else,
Right.
et cetera? All those types of things, right? Do they have a good Wi-Fi signal at home if that's part of what's needed? Or are they going to be using it in a totally different context that you hadn't even thought of?
Yeah.
It's so true. It's so true. Because I think a lot of times we put all kinds of time and energy into solving what we think the real problem is, but we don't actually. We miss the right problem from the get go. So I think with a lot of this, that's what's really interesting. And it might be different for, for different populations or different kinds of equipment or what have you. But that I think is for, for any of us that are in a space that deals with technology of just really reminding ourselves over and over again that technology is only a small component of it.
And it's funny too, looking at a lot of the, and Bernhard and I were involved in auditing a number of clinical processes over the course of our time together.
Hmm.
And it's very much a patchwork quilt.
Yeah.
It's a lot of different pieces of tech that were never designed, with each other in context. Many of them were designed in silos. They optimized for the happy path. Like your browser anecdote is a good example. It's a basic thing that I'm sure a tech person somewhere in the back halls of whatever company designed that solution was like, well, everybody knows what a browser is. They've been around for 30, 40 years. And what's the big deal?
Right. Yeah.
But this notion of like, let alone browser, let alone internet
Yeah.
access,
Yeah. Right.
which like, rural areas is still problematic in the 21st century. So yeah, there's a question there. How much of this is design flaws or the nature of there being no standards that are expressed across a group of technology purveyors versus a clinical issue or an issue with the care provider?
Yeah. Makes me think, at the end of the day, whether it's individual companies or whether it's broadband access or whatever it might be, there are no real aligned incentives to make any of it really work together. It's a very siloed, first to market, gain your shares, push your thing forward, and mostly for short term benefits of then taking whatever has happened and then, sort of flipping it and moving along the way. And you see that a lot, whether it's I think the patient dealing with that and trying to cobble things together or the healthcare providers trying to cobble things together. By that, things have been bought, put into place. They seemed really great, in that moment. And then it doesn't really work long term. And I think that there's a lot that we could learn and change. And it wouldn't be straightforward or easy necessarily, but how do we align some of those incentives so that it is about data flowing the way that it needs to flow across different devices in a secure, safe, private way and with end products that really work for people. I don't know how exactly to get to that utopia, but I know as long as our incentives are very individualistic by person, by company, it's going to be really hard to get there.
Yes, exactly. Some countries are actually looking at coming up with a countrywide strategy to solve this problem, and
Mm,
that works in some countries where healthcare is national, for instance. I think those countries may jump ahead of us at some point just because they're thinking of it in an aggregated manner. They're
yeah.
thinking of all the different types of users that they have and all the physicians and all the technology that hospitals are already struggling with. And they're starting at a different place than most companies which are just focused on this one thing that we're creating. They're
Hmm.
starting up at the top, which is what do we need overall to make this really work societally?
Yeah.
So I think there are a couple of areas where I think it's going to be easier over time. And we touched on it earlier around telemedicine, right? The stuff that is in the hospital where we have large capital equipment and really complex internal processes and a lot of turf and a whole bunch of things happening that people have been trying to integrate forever. And it's a slow slog, I think. But if you look at things outside of the hospital, things like remote monitoring, therapies that are applied at home by the patient or that are passively applied, all those types of things are potentially integrating really well with telemedicine, right? And so, to the extent that telemedicine has gotten a big jolt and that does not fade away, Right now, there's a big push towards really market share as opposed to a better mousetrap for managing all of these chronic conditions. But as a device manufacturer, whether that's for point of care COVID diagnostics or for continuous glucose monitoring or whatever it may be, if those telemedicine providers get real and meaningful market share, this is another channel. And so integrating well with those things could be a really good thing for anyone who is doing home care, therapies that are not within the 4 or 24 walls of the hospital.
Yeah. I think it's interesting thinking about certain health systems to the point earlier about having a national health system. When you look at groups like the VA, I think that's an awesome entity to look at that functions in that way when you get all under one umbrella and your incentives are aligned in the same way. What does that look like? That system is doing amazing things for the veterans across our country. And I think that there are some of those bright spots of, you know, how do we learn from each other? How do we share some of those things? How do we take some of those that might have those kind of extreme situations that do align to try to bring people through a new place? What can we learn from them? And I really don't know that many people take advantage out in the, private sectors to look at places like that.
Well, I think there's a question too of going back to Bernhard's analogy of telehealth and sort of BYOD
Mhm.
environments where you've got your own monitoring device. And we've heard this from physicians and doctors in the past. It's like they don't want that data
Oh, yeah.
in their ecosystem because they're like, yeah, I get it. You got your health watch. Bully for you. I don't trust the sensors on that thing. I don't want the liability. I don't want it anywhere near the EMR. I
Yeah.
don't want it anywhere near any of my clinical practices because I don't want to be liable for it. And so some of this is a quality issue
Yeah.
for sure.
Mm.
Like, I mean, you could argue that to your utopia comment earlier, yeah, there's a utopia that's possible, but are we really boiling the ocean here? Or is it more just at what point are we going to be responsible for providing better technology that's just, put it bluntly, competently designed to work within these environments? It isn't designed for play purposes or non life management purposes where it's a hobby and it becomes a critical path thing? Are we trying to take hobbyist tools and implement it into the clinical workflow? And that's why we're seeing pushback that we're seeing.
I think a lot of people do look at smartwatches and other kinds of monitors, health monitors, and say, look, this is already has a big section of people who are using it. So that means that this can be medical data. But the jump between a Fitbit and a medical device is
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah, it's a chasm.
Yeah.
And those companies are, like Fitbit's a good example. They're not incentivized to get into that game
Mhm.
necessarily. Apple, I remember the anecdote about the Apple Watch. They had always intended it to have medical or near medical capabilities, or at least sensors and so forth on it. They held a lot of that back because they didn't want to hold up the launch of the device. And I think it's understandable if you're a traditional retail based brand or company, but who are the medical device manufacturers that we have today? Like, what are the standards by which these new devices that are compatible with a clinical pathway and are dependable enough and produce medical quality data, but don't have a price point that puts them well out of the range of the average consumer? Like, what does that world look like such that we can start integrating more of these devices into the telehealth pathway?
I always say that the future in medical devices is here now and it's just not evenly distributed. So the areas where I think the kind of future is playing out in real time is in the diabetes space,
Yes.
right? Where really we already have lots of medical grade things that are integrated in with watches, with smartphones, et cetera, in terms of glucometers and continuous glucose monitors and applications in between for managing those things, and lots of feedback for clinicians as well as for patients. Is it perfect? No, but it's certainly moving at a rapid pace and lots of experimentation and integration between all of these things is happening. And I think it's happening faster there than in other areas. But I think those other areas will eventually get to the same place.
I would also have used diabetes care as the example of where it's working. It's partly, I think, because there are only two types of data really that are in play. One is we're monitoring your glucose and we're monitoring your insulin input. So, very specific and not overly complex technology to do that monitoring and capture that data. And it is exactly the data that a physician needs and will use. And some companies who are in that business have already dealt with the middleman of the insurance payer to find a way to pay both the physician and the user and whoever designed the device. Great example.
Are there other areas like that that we see maybe in the future? We always like to talk about like near term, midterm, long term. Are there any midterm opportunities that we see that are similar to that?
I think some of the examples of that might be happening in heart monitoring and implanted catheters and other devices that, I mean, we are implanting digital devices in people and collecting data from that. So I think those are another similar example of where this is working.
And I think there are other areas, again, where now we have therapies that are being delivered outside of a hospital setting. All the work in nerve stimulation, Adrian, you and I have worked on a couple of things in that where they're not all implanted nerve stimulators, but they're externally applied nerve stimulators or worn nerve stimulators for conditions. And you can get this great feedback loop on the therapy and the effects of the therapy and use that for a whole bunch of purposes, right? Change behavior, incentivize, that therapy being followed through on and actually modulating and changing those therapies. But then there are other areas that feel like they're really far behind right now, but it just takes one company deciding to go and to run with it, one large company that could change a whole area. So I personally would look at orthopedics as an area that in many ways is far behind where diabetes is in terms of monitoring, in terms of the data that's being collected, and frankly, in a lot of the sort of incentives around that. But if you look at what Zimmer Biomet, for example, is doing with the whole MyMobility area and everything that they've put together around that in terms of digital health, that's potentially game-changing. And if they do that, better believe that the various J&J groups and Stryker, et cetera, will be saying, if they're doing that, we've got to do it too.
Exactly. And each time a company solves the problem, it will build credibility for these devices. And little by little, we will build up the expertise and also the acceptance.
We'd like to thank our awesome guests for this podcast, Christy Zuber, the founder and managing director of Aspen Labs, and Gia Roselles, director of user experience at Becton Dickinson. I'm Bernhard Kappe.
And I'm Adrian Pittman. Thank you for listening. In the next part of this series, we're going to dive into the art and science of user-centered research and design processes for medical devices. This is a really rich topic since our panelists bring a tremendous breadth and depth of experience to this exciting but really challenging domain. There's a lot of ground we're going to cover looking at not just UX for medical devices, but for healthcare more generally. And also what we can learn in healthcare from UX and other industries.
If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more content like it, you can check out Orthogonal's website at orthogonal.io. That's orthogonal.io. Our Insights section is regularly updated with fresh content related to connected medical device systems, software as a medical device, and digital therapeutics. You can also reach out to me at bkappe@orthogonal.io. That's BKAPPE at orthogonal.io.
Or reach me at iam@adrianpittman.com. That's IAM@adrianpittman.com. We look forward to hearing from you.